church in Africa is growing, it is young. We're a young continent, we're a growing continent, but for many years, the church growth in Africa has not really resulted in any significant change in the way people live or how people's lifestyles or values are changed. The reason why many Christians do not find it easy to live out their faith in the public square, in the marketplace, is because we've not really given them a framework to think or even to see the significance of not just influencing what they do, but the environment in which they work, influencing the values, the beliefs, and the foundational thoughts of their culture.
There's a desperate need for churches to be recovering it and to make it an emphasis within their church to for instance, bring people up that are in law or in medicine or carpenters or construction workers, and you know how sometimes they commission people that are pastors and lay hands on them in front of the church, or as they go out on a mission trip to a foreign country. But perhaps bring people up from professions and commission them, lay hands on them, and set them apart as people that are valued in the work to bring God's kingdom and rule and reign to bear within the world. I mean, that's a crucial thing for us to recover that, to pray regularly for people in professions, not just for people that are sick. That's a good thing, of course, but to pray for people in the various professions, as a homemaker or as a construction worker or in law or in government, that people might have real wisdom there. And to value that kind of work, not just in quote spiritual work, but there's a sense in which all work is spiritual. I think that there's so much that needs to be done.
Before Christ went to the cross, he prayed with his disciples and for his disciples. We know this prayer as the high priestly prayer. And I'd like to look at part of it as we move into this new session. So if you look at John 17, 15 through 19. In this part of Jesus' prayer, he is praying for those who are going to follow him and follow the disciples. And he says this, "My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified." What is to be the relationship between the church and the world? And we find in this prayer of Jesus a principle that answers that question. First, notice what Jesus did not pray. He could have prayed, "Father, take them out of the world." But he specifically said, "My prayer is not that you take them out of the world." Why did Jesus pray this way? Because he wants his people in the world, not out of the world. And he said, "Just as you have sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world." When we think of the church today, we tend to think of the church as a building. And people come to the church for worship and for church programs. But let me suggest that when we think of the church as a building, we are not thinking of the church the way Christ thought of the church. Christ thought of the church as people, his body. They were the koinonia, the community, the nation of priests. Whenever the New Testament talks about the church, it talks about people, not a building. And in the biblical concept, the church gathers and the church scatters. And this is why Jesus is saying, "Father, I do not pray that you keep them out of the world or take them out of the world, because He wants His people, His body, to be in the world. When John Wesley preached Christ crucified in England, he preached Christ crucified so that people would come to Christ for salvation. There was a personal application of the cross of Christ. It was so people would be saved and they would go to heaven. But Wesley also understood that there was to be a public manifestation of the preaching of Christ crucified. He wanted to see societies transformed. He wanted to see social and cultural sanctification, not just personal justification. The missionary statesman Lesslie Newbigin said this in his book, Truth to Tell, the Gospel as Public Truth. He said this: "A serious commitment to evangelism, to telling the story which the church is sent to tell, means a radical questioning of the reigning assumptions about public life. It is to affirm the gospel not only as an invitation to a private and personal decision, but a public truth which ought to be acknowledged as true for the whole of the life of society." The gospel does not simply have private meaning. Jesus in my life, Jesus in my heart. But the gospel has a public meaning. And we need to allow the gospel to become the reigning assumption for all of public life. He continues, "The incarnate Word is Lord of all, not just of the church. There are not two worlds, one sacred and the other secular. There are different ways of understanding the one world, and a choice has to be made about which is the right way, the way that corresponds to reality, to the reality beyond all the show which the ruler of this world can put on." It's not two ways of two worlds, one sacred, one secular. It's one world, but how do we see that world? And which of the ways of seeing the world comports with reality? We have to proclaim the gospel, not merely to individuals in their personal and domestic lives. We do certainly have to do that. But we have to proclaim it as part of the continuing conversation that shapes public doctrine. It must be heard in the conversation of economists, psychiatrists, educators, scientists, and politicians. We have to proclaim it as the truth. Biblical truth is not simply religious and spiritual. Biblical truth comports with reality, and we need to have a conversation in every area of life based on a biblical framework. Proverbs 31:23 gives us an understanding, a picture of how we might see this. It speaks of the godly woman. It says her husband is respected in the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. In Old Testament times, the gates of the city were not simply the place where the city was defended. The gates of the city in the Old Testament were the places where public life took place. In the city gates, business and commerce took place. Laws were read and adjudicated. Governing and administration of the city took place at the city gates. News and public announcements, public meetings and discourse. The city gates were the place where the life of the city occurred. When we think of the city gates today, we can think of them as the sectors of a society, the spheres of influence in a society, the domains or place of dominion in society, the place of governance, or from one of our last sessions, the place of occupancy, where we occupy until Jesus returns. How do we move beyond the individual application of the gospel towards an understanding that the gospel is to impact the culture as a whole? We need to begin to think in terms of occupying the gates of the city. Having Christians who are doctors, Christians who are businessmen, Christians who are educators, Christians who are artists, who are athletes, Christians who are not just Christians on Sunday, but Monday Christians, who see as their role helping to occupy the city gate of education, the city gate of governance, the city gate of business, where the gospel has an opportunity to impact and help govern at that gate. Every vocational sphere or realm, whether it's government, business, economics, education, is shaped by the prevailing worldview of the culture. Today's worldview that governs the Western world is the worldview of evolutionism or Darwinism, naturalism. We've talked about this in many different ways in this class. But this is the prevailing worldview, and it is determining what happens at the city gates. We are to be people of the cross, people of the gospel. We are to be people who go to the city gates to represent the kingdom of God and the values and principles of Jesus Christ at those gates. The question is the church consciously and proactively seeking to be at the city gates? We need to have Christians in government and law thinking proactively about how do I function at the city gate of government and law, of education, etc. Because Christ is Lord, the Christian should be occupying the city gates out of a motive that Jesus would be glorified, but also that the community, the nation would be blessed by the truth, beauty, and goodness of the culture of the kingdom of God being manifested at the city gates. To be disciples of all nations, the church must think strategically about occupying the gates. Who is occupying the gates of your city? What ideas and concepts are ruling there? What programs and policies and norms are functioning there? What needs to change if our communities and our nation is going to be reformed and revitalized? What things need to change, and how do I and my profession contribute to that change? In the book, The Strategies of Taking Charge, the author said this: if there was ever a moment in history when comprehensive strategic view of leadership was needed, not just by a few leaders in high office, but by large numbers of leaders in every job, it is now. It is not enough to think of, well, if we can get Christians elected to Parliament or to Congress. It's not enough to think if we can get a Christian in the White House or in Buckingham Palace. It's not enough to think in these terms. We need to think of leaders, Christian leaders, in every job, occupying the gates of the city. Historically, the church has understood this. John Calvin, when he was in Geneva, he not only preached at the cathedral on Sunday, but during the week he taught at the Geneva Chapel next to the cathedral. And people came from all over Europe to hear Calvin teach from the Bible about governance, about economics, about every area of life. John Wesley, when he brought the gospel, he created circles of relationships and circles of people for discipling of nations. And out of Wesley's revival came the Clapham sect, which God used mightily to transform the nation. Out of John Wesley's preaching came Arthur Guinness, the founder of the Guinness Brewery, who saw the application of the gospel. What does it mean to be a Christian who is a brewer? And he dealt with that question. We need to have people who are thinking in these terms. This is a graphic that can help us understand it. You see Christians gathering, the inward arrows on Sunday for equipping, for corporate worship, scattering, the arrows pointing outwards to the gates of the city. This is the church, not a building, but the people of God gathering and scattering to the gates of the city. We need to make a distinction between evangelical Gnosticism and biblical theism. Gnosticism says, make disciples in every nation. Biblical theism says, make disciples of all nations. Evangelical Gnosticism says, work is the place to do spiritual ministry. Biblical theism says, no, work is the place through which the kingdom of God is advanced. Evangelical Gnosticism says, I work to make money to support missions. Biblical theism says, work is the place of mission. Evangelical Gnosticism thinks of a Christian in the workplace as simply being moral and doing moral and spiritual good things in the workplace. No. Biblical theism says thinking biblically and theologically about my work is my task. I am to do my work as unto Christ. What role will you play? Will you see yourself as occupying the gates of the city? And what role will pastors play to see this take place? Pastors and teachers need to be equippers of their congregation. They need to consistently teach from the pulpit on a biblical worldview, biblical precepts, and a theology of vocation. I've been a Christian now for well over 50 years. I've heard 2 sermons in my whole life on work. What does this say about where the church is? When all the people in the church that compose the congregation work day after day, year after year, 2 sermons on work in 50 years. No, work and the concept of theology vocation needs to be taught from the pulpit on a regular basis. We need to have discipleship classes to prepare people to work holistically in the marketplace, in the public square. We need to have public ceremonies to commission and send equipped businessmen to minister in the marketplace, lawyers into the judicial system, public servants into government. We need to establish local church sectoral cell groups to study and apply biblical truth and principles into their application. We don't need to start another church program, but simply churches, we have Bible studies. Let's focus the Bible studies sectorally, where people that are involved in law can study the Bible to see what it says about law. People that are businessmen and women study the Bible to see what it says about business. And then we need to establish churches in the city. I don't mean plant another church, but the concept of the church of the city, of your city, of Philadelphia, of Washington, of London, where the sectoral groups the health sector, the law sector, begin to meet together within the city to think strategically and plan. How can Christian healthcare workers begin to have an impact in healthcare in the city? And finally, we need to establish Christian city action councils to bring leaders from all the vocations together to think strategically and holistically or comprehensively about impacting the city for the kingdom of God.